here we are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and we are here today with Patti Smith. Patti is a naturalist and licensed wildlife rehabilitator. She's worked at BEEC, the Bonnyvale Environmental Education Center, since 1991, where she creates programs, events, and leads nature discovery walks. Also a writer and illustrator, many folks know Patti and her animal friends from her popular column, The View from Heifer Hill, which runs monthly in the Brattleboro Reformer. Welcome, Patti.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy. It's great to be here, and hello, Brattleboro.
Yes, and you've probably seen a lot of folks from Brattleboro up at BEEC.
I certainly have, and I've seen folks from Brattleboro since I was born here ever so many years ago.
Yes.
And it's so nice to be invited to this show where I can revel in being from this wonderful little town.
Yes, born and raised.
Born and
Born
raised.
and raised. That's so great.
And
I
very
know.
much influenced by the surroundings.
The natural surroundings.
The natural surroundings.
Yes, you spent a lot of time outdoors.
I sure did.
Yes.
I spent my childhood crawling on my hands and knees in the woods behind the house, making trails and imagining that all of the trees were talking to me, and of course all of the animals were my friends.
Oh, wow. Were you pretty much by yourself when you did that?
I did have a few brothers, and yes, need I say more? This is why I was by myself in the woods on my hands and knees, pretending the animals were my friends. No offense, brothers. It's...
You were sort of living in a kind of magical world.
I think that's very safe to say.
Yeah. I was an only child, so I spent a lot of time outside as well. And creating, I don't know about creating worlds, but it did become part of, as I'm sure it did for you, part of my environment.
Yes, yes.
As much as being in the house, going outside.
Yeah, and to this day I feel like the woods around my house are part of my home. My living room is down by the brook, and it's very important to me that the woods that I explore be directly connected to the doors of my house.
Yes, actually you had a great quote. Generally speaking, I'm not someone who travels to world destinations to learn about things. I open up the back door.
Yes.
And you still do that?
I still do that, and now that I've gotten to know a lot of the various characters that live in the woods behind me, and what the trees are doing in different seasons and what the birds are doing in different seasons, it's very hard to tear myself away.
Did you personify, anthropomorphize the woods, the individual trees, the animals?
Oh, absolutely.
You did?
I had names for all of the trees on the school bus route, for example. Well, not all of them, just the outstanding ones. And the trees in the woods behind my house, some of them had names. And I think this was very much influenced by the children's literature that I admired. You know, Beatrix Potter, Thornton Burgess. Were you familiar with his work?
Yes, his whole series of books.
Yes, and we are warned as scientists and naturalists later in life that anthropomorphism is a bad thing. But I feel like it's so important. It's such a great thing for children to begin to have that imagined relationship with nature.
Yes.
When they're in that developmental stage. And at some later point in your life, you can say, all right, I don't really believe that tree knows me and loves me, but I know that tree and I love that tree.
And you have a connection.
Yes.
With those different elements.
Yes.
Yes. And watch them grow.
And watch
as
them
well.
grow.
As you said, you were mainly alone when you were doing this. Did you share your world with other people?
I think I told my parents and my siblings stories about some of the characters that were out there. Yeah, and I did write a book about the frogs. I went through a frog phase.
Did your family support all of this with you?
Oh, very much.
Oh, good.
Yeah. It was back in the days of free-range children, of course, so go out and play was the refrain. And I feel so bad for children who can't do that these days.
Yes, or don't have access.
Don't have access. Yeah, and it wasn't just go play in the woods, but you can do or be whatever you want to be. There was no pressure to find a lucrative career, for example. I may regret that now, but
But you probably don't,
no,
is my guess.
I really don't.
Yeah, no, I think you've really found your way. So you went to academy school in West Brat,
Yes.
and then middle school, and
Middle school, we moved 3 miles up the road to Guilford. So I went to middle school in Guilford.
because they went to 8th grade. That's
Yeah,
right. Yes, and then you did a little bit of a hybrid in
And
high
then
school.
I did a little bit of a hybrid. I went to 9th grade at BUHS, and I really enjoyed my biology class. That was great. But I did not enjoy the social scene at BUHS, sorry. And what's more, I noticed that there really weren't any classes post-biology that would fill my keen desire to learn more about the natural sciences.
Yes.
Especially since I was college bound, and there may have been classes, but they were not aimed at that level. So
Yeah, I bet that's changed.
it has.
Has
I
it?
think it has
Yeah.
changed. Yeah.
And I think that the whole notion of ecological study and that kind of thing in high school is probably very different than it was.
We have a science teacher on our board who teaches at BUHS, and he does a great job. Yeah.
So what did you do instead of going to BUHS?
So I did some homeschooling. My mother was running a school at our house at the time, and so it was maybe a little bit easier for me to slip under the radar, but I did have the blessing of the local school district and a pile of textbooks, and I did as little of that sort of studying as possible and spent all my time in the woods near our house. And I became acquainted with some of the writers at that time who were addressing the environmental issues. So Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, and Donella Meadows and limits to growth. And,
Yes.
And I was very worried about climate change even then, and that was in the 70s. So
Also was the heyday of all of those books that you mentioned. You know, they were, I can picture all of the covers. You know, they were coming out one after the Whole Earth catalog. You know, Frances Moore Lappé, who was also a local person. Yeah, there was a lot going on. So if you're self-studying back then, you did have things to choose from.
yes, children today, the things they have to be afraid of, it's not just losing natural places, it's losing,
Yes.
I hesitate to say it, but we know what the stakes are these days with climate change and the loss of natural spaces on a planet-wide scale.
It's so heartening to see how many young people, especially in this community, who are getting to be very active and become activists.
And do you know what I love most about these children? I went to a climate change rally at the State House, and it was mostly adults in attendance that day, and none of the speakers mentioned the impact of climate change on other species and the planet itself. It was all human impacts. But when we had the great youth rally here, was it a few years ago now, pre-COVID?
Yes.
And so many of the teens were speaking passionately about other species and the impact on the planet.
Yes.
And I was so happy that day.
Yeah, talking about your childhood and your relation to the natural world. And I think that during that time, kids are so attuned to animals,
Yes.
you know, in so many different ways. And I see how kids grow out of that to a certain degree. Or, you know, they become more domesticated kind of animals, that they're into dogs and cats and that kind of thing.
I went through a horse phase for sure.
Did you?
Oh,
Yeah.
many years.
So in some ways, that's a real entryway into relationships, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's where I learn to speak animals such as I do. And by that I mean learn what they mean by their expressions and body postures and how they interact with the world and communicate with me. And I find that this is a universal language, and you can understand what a moose is saying to you if you know what a horse is saying to you. And it's made me very attuned to the boundaries between animals, in particular wild animals. I'm always, when I see a wild animal and it sees me and we're aware of each other, I know that there is a distance between us that feels safe to that animal. The distance changes based on how I'm behaving. And on the cover around the animal, and I'm just curious to try and communicate with that animal from outside of that boundary where the animal feels safe.
Yeah, yes. That must be really interesting.
It is interesting, especially when I feel like something has been exchanged. Even if it's just the animal says, oh, I see you and I see that you are no threat, so I'm going to just continue with my business.
Have you found over the years that you can read that better and better as it goes along? Yeah.
Especially as a wildlife rehabilitator.
Right.
As a wildlife rehabilitator, I have an opportunity to learn so many things about wildlife that really aren't accessible in any other way, because you're raising orphaned animals, and so you learn how they talk to their mothers. So I've learned about the vocalizations that many different species make. They're called contact noises. So between mother and baby, would you like to hear some of them?
Yes. Yes, please.
Well, porcupine may be my favorite, and this is their friendly noise. And of course I can't reproduce it perfectly, but it's something like and the babies make all kinds of squawky noises when they're unhappy about things. So it's more like and then they'll just follow you along like a little waddling urchin, making their noise. Baby beavers have this, it's more in the back of the mouth and a little squeakier. Squirrels, it's more like a little grunty noise. Possums make this little clicky, sneezy, actually it's a sneezy noise. All right, we'll stop right there.
Oh, it's great though. It's great. And also what you're saying is because you're up close and personal, you're helping to heal these animals. So they are captive in the best sense of the word. In terms of your attention and what you're doing. And they're relating to you in a way that must be very out of their ken.
Oh, I can't imagine, except that for all birds and mammals, one of their basic needs is mother. And if they no longer have the mother they were born to, they are ready to accept whoever will provide that nurturing. And so they will shift quite rapidly in many cases. And
food probably has something to do with that as well.
Not as much as you might think.
Really?
Certainly the adult wild animals that I have to care for, the injured adults, they're only interested in food and not the least bit interested in me. But with the babies, they could have all the food they want, but they would still want a warm body to hang on to.
Right. You have had some long-term relationships with some animals.
Yes, I surely have.
Can you talk about that? Because it's been years that you've been with.
It has been years and years, and I have to think about how to approach this, because I can go right back to that transition from childhood to adulthood, where I expected the animals around me to be my friends and had these imaginary relationships with them. And then as I grew up and studied biology and animal behavior and other natural sciences, and learned that, gosh, it's actually not a good idea for most animals to think that people are their friends. for starters, and they have every reason to be terrified of us.
Yes.
So I contented myself with just learning as much as I could about them, mostly by tracking in my woods and seeing what they were up to when I wasn't around. And then I read this book called Beaver Sprite, in which this woman, I think it was in the 1930s, 40s, in the Adirondacks, some wild beavers were reintroduced into a brook in her backyard. And she became crazy about beavers and spent all of her time watching them. And they became great friends of hers, and this little light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, beavers. Okay, some of the reasons you should not make friends with wild animals are they might decide that all humans are their friends and go up and knock on other people's doors, and other people might say, yikes, rabies. Or you might have lots of animals congregating at an unnatural food source, as happens with our bird feeders, alas. And or they're altering their behavior in some way to travel to, that's what I just said, to a new food source. So there's the issue of disease and becoming habituated to people and altering their behaviors, but none of those things would be true of the beavers that lived way out in the woods behind my house. They're just going to stay there in their brook and do their own thing. And if someone shows up and brings them an apple, well, that's just fine. They're not going to follow me home. No other beavers are going to come there. So I decided that year I would make friends with the beavers that lived a mile out on the brook behind my house. And that really changed my life in a number of ways. First, I'll describe the process. I went down to the brook, to the beaver pond, and decided that I would start some experiments in animal communication. So I pretended I was an herbivore, of course, and paid no attention at all to the beavers, because that's what a carnivore would do. A carnivore would hide silently behind the bushes and try not to be noticed. So I just sat out there on the banks of the pond and looked around and nibbled on some plants. And when the beavers swam by, I said hello, but didn't pay them much attention. And within 9 visits, they were coming onto the shore near where I was sitting and were perfectly relaxed. And I was bringing them poplar branches, a favorite beaver food. So they were all coming over to eat the poplar branches. And suffice it to say that I have now been following the fortunes of this beaver clan for 13 years. And it's gradually they've become more and more trusting, and the things that I have been able to learn as a result of having this kind of relationship with the beavers are things that really you can't learn from remote studies of animals.
Right. And you're experiencing it right there. Which is completely different.
Yes.
The things that you write for the Reform of the View from Heifer Hill chronicles a lot of this. You wrote a book about
this is true.
Your beaver and the family, and also the newsletter, the BEEC newsletter, which has some wonderful writing in it. Your writing, you will have a subject and go on about the details of whether it's an animal or the woods. Fred Homer is another wonderful contributor, always entertaining. So there's so many wonderful things that BEEC brings forward, the newsletter being one of them. And I would like to give a shout out to the website, because it's really clear and easy, and there are so many things available to folks, so many resources, from how to get critters out of your chimney to different camps that are available. But you can talk more about that too, Patti. So BEEC started back in '91, and this was property that was donated by Paul and Dorothea Stockwell. And it was a big piece of land, and you've been there ever since, developing and doing different things there.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but Paul and Dorothea Stockwell were a wonderful, they were an old couple when I met them, late 80s. And Dorothea, alas, was on her deathbed when I finally met her.
Yeah.
But they were so dedicated to community.
Yes.
And they really wanted to make sure that this beautiful farm that they had acquired would be a resource for the community. And that took a number of iterations over the years. It was an incubator space for artisans for a little while. It was one of the area communes for a while. It finally became an environmental education center. And I was just so delighted to be the very first staff person to come on board when it was still just an idea. I had been living on the other side of the state at the time and wanting to move back to the Brattleboro area. And what could be better than helping to launch an environmental education center, which was the only thing that I felt Brattleboro had been lacking in my own childhood.
It really was the first, I think.
Yes.
The first of its kind here, yes.
Yes. And something that I feel would have been a boon to myself as a child.
Absolutely, yes. And you do all kinds of different things with kids and adults there.
Yes.
Yes, lots of programs.
We have 3 educators who focus on youth programming, and they're active in the schools, all of the schools in the region. And upcoming, we have Spring Explorers Camp for Spring Vacation Week.
Oh, good.
And registration is also open for summer camps, and they're camps that really help kids just enjoy the natural world and in a gentle, supportive environment, but really getting out there and spending the whole day in the woods. Being kids.
Interactive. Yeah.
Very.
Yeah, very interactive with the pandemic, which we're not out of the woods, so to speak. How did that affect BEEC?
Oh my gosh. Instant reversal, as we all experienced, a screeching halt on certain activities and a scramble to come up with new ways to reach people. And I have to confide that I'm a bit of a fan of Zoom. I know. It's you might not have guessed that, but it's I like to not have to go anywhere for meetings. I like to be able to just stay at home, and you can reach a whole different audience when things are virtual.
Yes.
So one of the first things that we did was we were able to bring all of the school kids out to visit my beavers at the beaver pond.
Oh.
And various porcupine friends I have out there, because the youth program educators and their cameraman were able to come along with me. And there are some wonderful, very charming videos on our website if you want to visit the beavers and the porcupines. They're made for the school children, but you might enjoy them too.
Absolutely. There's not a lot of difference of whether you're an adult or a child going out in the woods, right?
Right, right. And you get to meet Henry, the wonderful beaver, who was the mate of Willow.
One of my big hopes with the pandemic was that many people in many places would realize how great it is to be outside. And I think so many people did. It was one way we could communicate and be with our friends and all of that. So I would think that BEEC would get a nice little bump.
Pretty early in the pandemic, able to start doing paddles outside, which was kind of a new thing.
Oh, paddles?
Yeah, so we did a lot of paddles on interesting wild ponds. You know, if you're in a kayak, then you're definitely 6 feet from other people.
That's right.
And that worked out really well.
Very cool.
We've been encouraging people to come and use our trails, and I still encourage you all to come and visit the trails. There are 2 miles of trails at our site in West Brattleboro.
Yes.
Beautiful hilltop view. They're a little steep for skiing, but great for snowshoeing.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
get out in any season, and so quiet. One of the things that we've been doing for the last few years now are naturalist outings. The emphasis is really on poking around and discovering, and who cares how far we get. And I love how much more I can see when there are many eyes directed to the woods.
There's another great quote of yours, which was, I think the more you notice that there are more things to notice, like how advanced the sedge flowers are, or what the dragonflies are up to.
Exactly. One of my favorite discoveries was on one of these naturalist outings last summer. A woman saw this insect flying, and it was the strangest thing, and we were all just entranced by it. It is very appropriately named the phantom crane fly. And it's a phantom because you only see the white tips of its legs, and it looks like it's not flapping wings at all, but just sort of hovering in midair, and it's very eerie. But I never would have met the phantom crane fly without many eyes.
Do you have the app on a phone where you can look up different things? And
Other people on these walks do.
I'll bet they do. And how do you find that?
I like it.
You do.
I admit it. I like it.
Information, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's kind of a funny thing about naming the species you see out there, and that's just one way of knowing the world. But our human brains are just so wired to categorize things, and what I have found is that once you name something, then you start to notice the variation and how, oh, that is also this, but it's different, and then the branching begins. And I find personally that having names for things really helps me learn a lot faster and more.
I think that's really interesting, because instead of it putting something in a box, right, you're identifying it. So it has an identity.
It has an identity, but they're not all going to be the same. So
yeah. It's fascinating. Patti, you have had a lifelong relationship with the natural world, right? It's been part of your life.
Yes.
It is your life.
It is my life.
It's your environment in all kinds of different ways. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
You are so welcome.
Yeah, it's really wonderful to hear your stories.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today. We are heading into spring. I know it's not here yet, but Patti is giving us reason to hope, and we're looking forward to that. We thank Patti for all of this great information, and believe me, she's got a lot of tremendous stories. So tune into BEEC. Their website is easy to get to. It's just BEEC, B-E-E-C. If you do that, BEEC Vermont, you'll get there, and you'll see everything that they offer. Also, all of the interesting stories, their newsletters, et cetera, et cetera. It's right here, just out of town. I think it's 2.2 miles up Bonnyvale Road. So tune in and find out what's available there. Thanks for being with us. Come back again. We will have somebody else who is fun and interesting, and we were glad to have you today.